I, Hannah Sampson, would like to start off this webinar by welcoming you all and distinguished chief guest, Professor Arun Kumar, who's the former professor of economics in Jawaharlal Nehru University. And he is the Malcolm Adisha Chair Professor at the Institute of Social Sciences. So the topic for today's webinar is Navigating India-US Trade Challenges, Understanding Trump's Tariff Strategy, in conversation with Air Marshal M. Matheswaran, sir. And I would like to put on the ground rules. You can switch off your the mic, and when in need, when you want to ask the question, you can maybe switch. There are options where you can raise your hand, and yeah, that's all. And I would pass it on to Air Marshal Matheswaran, sir.
Thank you, Hannah, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Arun Kumar, the former economics professor in the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Malcolm Adiseshaya, chair in the Institute of Social Sciences. He's also a distinguished fellow at the Peninsula Foundation. It's a great pleasure to have him this evening on a very important topic, the whole world in terms of economic structures is under disruption. Thanks to Trump's second term, and the tariff, on the face of it, looks like very offhand and a disruptive strategy followed by him. But I think we all believe that there is a significant plan and a strategy in the background that's underway, and this is what we are trying to understand, as well as what would be the impact both in the short term and medium term. We have an Indian team led by the Mr. Piyush Goyal and the Foreign Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, who are visiting this week for resuming the trade talks. And in this context, the first major question that I raise is, of course, is Trump's tariff plan a disruptive strategy? And is it part of a grand reset of the global trade architecture, which was established post-1945 by the US? And now that the US is being challenged in this domain by China and many rising powers, economic powers, is this a deliberate strategy? Is one. And second is, how will Trump's tariff strategy affect India's long-term aspirations for export-led growth, supply chain modernization, and domestic employment, especially in sectors most expected to US market risk? And is it also time for us to think on a long-term basis to somewhat decouple from the US and the West and diversify our trade markets and relations to the rest of the world? I think some kind of an indication is there when India and Brazil have voiced their opinions quite strongly in this area as well. And of course, the SEO conference or the SEO meeting that was held end of last month with Putin, Xi, and Prime Minister Modi indicating in their statements some kind of a change or restructuring of the economic architecture or the global architecture overall in the context of the American pressure. Without taking any further time, let me invite Professor Arun Kumar to give his initial comments, and thereafter we could take it forward in the discussions. Professor Arun Kumar, how are you?
Thank you very much, Air Marshal Matheswaran, for inviting me to this talk. First thing is President Trump is behaving like a king. He's squeezing whoever he can. He has not spared his closest allies, whether it be Canada, EU, Japan, South Korea, and so on. And he's, demanding concessions from them. For instance, he wants their export to the US to have 15% tariff, whereas he wants the US export into these countries to have 0% tariff. And plus, he's squeezing them for investment. So EU is planning to spend $600 billion investment in the USA. Japan is planning to have investment of $550 billion. And EU is also planning to buy more energy from them and defense equipment. So in other words, he's trying to get the maximum advantage from everybody. Now the question is, he's also trying to squeeze India. But is India in a position to actually concede to his demands? Because there are two key demands that he has. One, he is voicing very openly, that is our trade with Russia. That should come down. But that is very difficult for India to do because India depends very heavily still on Russian arms, especially critical things like S-400, Sukhoi aircraft, BrahMos missiles, and so on. So we cannot completely do away with the kind of trade that we have with Russia, and so we are not fully able to comply with that demand. Second is he wants our agriculture market to be opened up. Now that is also very difficult because our agriculture is very different from the US agriculture. In the US, the minimum farm size is 250 acres, whereas 85% of our farms are below 5 acres. Large number of them are 1 acre, 2 acre, half acre, and the capital they deploy is maybe 50,000 rupees, whereas the minimum capital on an American farm is said to be about 10 crores of rupees. And they get, an average farmer there gets a subsidy of 25, 26 lakhs of rupees, whereas an average farmer in the 2017-18 survey was earning from agriculture 27 rupees per person per day. So they earn about maybe a lakh or less than a lakh of rupees, whereas the American farmer gets a subsidy of 25, 26 lakhs of rupees. So in other words, the demand of Trump to open agriculture would damage the 46% workers who are working in agriculture. That's a huge population, whereas in the US, roughly about 1% of the population is in agriculture. So our agriculture being very different and there being a lot of poverty, it's very difficult to see that India can comply with opening up of the agriculture market to the American produce, because then the price here will drop below the MSP. Farmers are already complaining that they're not getting enough income from agriculture. So that would be further damaged. So these are two demands which India cannot comply with, but Trump is pressurizing us again and again. You can see that not only has he levied 25% punitive tariff, but he's also asked EU to levy an extra tariff on India. On Chabad port, he's taking steps, and that is crucial for India. Then now H-1B visas. So one after the other, there are things that he's doing to actually put India in place. And many of the US bigwigs, whether it be J.D. Vance, whether it be Lutnick, whether it be the Treasury Secretary and others, they're saying India wants to be a strategic partner, but it's not acting like a strategic partner. So what they want is that for India to be completely in the US camp and give the concessions that they want. They say that that's the only way that you can get concessions from us. So now with a 50% tariff, about 50% of India's export to the US will be impacted. There are 50% others like pharmaceuticals, electronics, the duties are not there. But this 50% which will be affected is all labor intensive. So whether it be gems and jewelry, whether it be apparel and textiles and leather goods and things like that, that will be affected. So roughly about $47 billion worth of exports are being impacted, especially because our competitors like China, Vietnam, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they will have much lower tariffs. So they'll be able to supply the US market at a much lower price than India would. So our exports to the US will suffer this $47 billion as has been estimated by some people. And it is said that about 50 lakh people who are working there, their jobs are on the line if this thing is not sorted out soon. So therefore, there'll be implication for exports, there'll be implication for India's GDP growth, there'll be implication for India's employment generation and demand within the economy. So all these macroeconomic impacts will be there if this tariff continues for long. So we need to come to some kind of a agreement. Now, see, the PM had said that we have very good relationships with the US and with the US president. But now the delusion that we were in, that is shattered. We were hoping that we would get more concessional tariff than, say, China. And therefore, we'd be able to gain market share in the US market if Chinese goods are tariff more. But the opposite has happened. We have more tariff than these other economies who are our competitors. And therefore, it is we who are going to be suffering. Now, he's also said after the tariffs are levied that we'll defend Indian agriculture. But on the other hand, the cotton imports, the duties have been eliminated, the 11% duty that was there, and therefore the price has dropped below the MSP. And this has made the cotton farmers quite upset and angry. And other farmers are also very worried that whether their interests will be ultimately sacrificed by the Prime Minister. Now, what is clear is that these deals are all one-sided. As I mentioned, Japan, EU, South Korea, everybody has accepted the one-sided deal. So the tragedy is that the richest and the technologically most advanced nation is protecting itself against much poorer countries of Asia, of Africa, and so on, because he levied tariffs on other poor countries also. So what is the implication? As Air Marshal mentioned, multilateralism is being buried. This multilateralism that came with GATT in 1947-48, and then with WTO, it was expanded from 1st January 1995, that has been buried. He's not going by what agreements were there in WTO, and he's putting his own conditions on trade with every country. So it's actually bilateralism that is going. And there is global disquiet. Everybody is unhappy, whether it be Mexico or Canada or Brazil or China or India or EU, but there's helplessness. And why? That is because Mr. Trump has succeeded in dividing up the big trading partners. And therefore, he's got independent deals. He got a deal with UK, he got a deal with EU, and so on and so forth. Actually, if everybody had gone together and not yielded, then the situation could have been different. But he was very successful in delaying the application of the tariff, and then he bargained separately and got separate deals from. So my argument is that Donald Trump on April 2, 2025 announced these so-called reciprocal tariffs. He called it the Liberation Day for USA. He said the US will now become very prosperous. Now, when he uses the term reciprocity, that has a ring of justice, even though factually that is incorrect. For instance, take India. Earlier, Indian exports to the US would have 3% tariff, and US imports into India would have an average of 17%. So one could say that 14% maybe was a tariff that would have been reciprocal in some sense. But he announced 26%, and now there's 50%. Similarly, for China, he had announced 34%. The gap between the tariffs between China and USA is not 34%. So what actually he's doing is he's levying high tariffs to actually protect the US economy. So I call them protectionist tariffs and not reciprocal tariffs. And he implemented first in April, when he announced the tariffs, a 90 days pause. Then again in July, implemented a 1-month pause. And these were basically buying time to bargain with individual nations. And that's what I was saying, that, he managed to break the, so-called emerging unity amongst the other trading partners by everybody saying, okay, let me try and bargain separately with the US and try and get better terms. In the process, everybody is worse off at the moment. Now, what is the implication of this? That capitalism is being replaced. The soft face of capitalism, which was part of the multilateralism, is being replaced by a hard face. So capitalism from the mid-70s is increasingly turning hard. I remember, earlier in GATT, for instance, the trade in industrial goods was covered, but not agriculture, not services, not investments, not intellectual property right, etc. But, the American ambassador in 1982 told the Indian ambassador to GATT, the commerce secretary then, and he told me this. He said that now the Soviet Union cannot protect you. Therefore, we want your agriculture market. We have enough surpluses of various agriculture produce, we want to get your market open. And that's why in 1987, in the Uruguay round of negotiations at Puente del Este, you have all the new issues: trade in services, trade in agriculture, TRIPS, TRIMS, and so on. And then the Dunkel draft came in 1990. It was signed in Marrakesh in 1994, April 1, and it came into being on January 1. Now, there was a lot of give and markets to them in services and various other things that they wanted. And we got some concessions in our trade in other goods. So in other words, there was a give and take, and this was headed by the US. It is under the US leadership that all these changes are made under the WTO. So this hard phase was there, but still there was a give and take. If you notice from 1990, earlier, what the money that the advanced countries gave to the developing world was called aid. Now, aid has been replaced by capital flows, that you have to give concessions to attract capital into your country. And why is that happening? That is because capital has become highly mobile. There are 90 tax havens through which capital can move very quickly. And as capital has become highly mobile, it is extracting more and more concessions from national government, and not only national governments, even within the nation state, from the state governments. So if Andhra gives a concession, then Gujarat is forced to give that concession, and then UP has to offer the same concession. So capital is able to extract concessions, but labor is restricted. Labor is not so mobile, and therefore labor is not able to assert itself. And that's why what you see is globally a rightward drift across the world. Whether you see it in Europe, Asia, Latin America, this has been going on for the last 40, 45, 50 years. So the marginalized sections have lost out due to such globalization. But at least there was some give and take. So even though the marginalized sections were losing out, there was give and take between the nations. So the labor's gains post-World War II were lost after the 1970s. Mrs. Thatcher came in 1978, and he broke the back of trade unions in Britain. She went after the coal miners, print media, and various other. And Reagan came in 1980, and he pushed the policies further down the line. So in other words, this rightward drift that has taken place in the world, that has been underlying this hard face of capitalism everywhere in the world. Now, the question is that when in WTO, the idea was to have free trade, idea was that free trade is good. There are comparative advantages that are there. But what Mr. Trump is doing is that internally he's promoting free market, but externally he's not. So internally he's giving concession to businesses, like in taxation and so on, and he's giving like on energy production and so on, he's giving concessions there. But externally, he's actually turning protectionist. So there's a dichotomy. Internally, you support free market, but externally, you actually are against the free market. And the reason is there's a challenge of employment generation in the USA. So this trade war that is taking place is because capitalism is unable to generate enough jobs. And that is why the problem is coming. So in a sense, there are jobs in the USA, but good jobs have been going away. And Trump has been blaming China, Mexico, and India for this going away of the jobs. He's saying they're stealing the jobs. He said this in the first presidency, and he's saying it again during the campaign and later on. So the point is, he's been pressing companies, American companies like Ford and iPhone and so on, to bring their capital back and invest in the USA. This he was doing during pandemic also. Then also there's pressure for the US companies to bring capital back and create jobs within the USA rather than go outside. So the question arises, why is it that MNCs are investing abroad? So with the advent of WTO, the world has globalized rapidly. Production is globally integrated. There are long supply chains. Something produced in Saudi Arabia goes to Indonesia, from Indonesia to Bangladesh, and from Bangladesh to India. So the long supply chains are there everywhere. So the share of export and import in GDP has risen sharply everywhere. For instance, India's ratio of export to GDP and import to GDP was around 7% in 1991. It had reached 22% in 2023. For the US and Japan, it was around 6%, and that also rose to 15, 16%. So the world had much more of export and import. Now, in this situation, the MNCs were trying to maximize profit by producing in low-wage developing countries. So the point is that in the US, the minimum wage is about $7.25 nationally. But in some states, the minimum wage is $15 to $16 per hour. This is not per day. This is not per month. This is per hour. And in sectors where the desirable jobs are like aluminum, steel, automobiles, etc., the wages paid are $25 to $30. So at this wage, a worker in the US earns in one day what an Indian worker earns in 2 months. So the wage costs are way down here. And that's why when intermediate technology and low technology goods are there, the same technology is used whether in the US or China or India, then we can produce much cheaper because our wages are much lower than those in the USA. So USA will not be able to produce these goods cheaper unless they cut their wages, which would not be possible for the US economy to do because they have a higher living standard and so on and so forth. So why is all this happening? It is because globally, there are three stages of technology. There's a high technology, there's the intermediate technology, and the low technology. So low wages in the developing world have become a source of cheap supplies in the intermediate goods and the low technology goods. And also because so many of us are producing the same goods, say textiles, China is producing, India is producing, Vietnam is producing, Bangladesh is producing, etc. So we are all competing. So we are keeping our prices as low as possible. There's very strong competition in large number of these things. And when we compete and produce at low prices, we are supplying the advanced countries these goods at very low wages. But the advanced countries are producing high technology goods and services where they have some kind of a monopoly, and therefore they produce them and sell it to us. So there's a division of labor between where high technology goods, etc., are produced, where low technology and intermediate technology goods, etc., are producing. And their economies have become more services sector. So like the US now has 75% in the services sector. So they wanted to sell services to us like insurance, banking, and so on and so forth. But the problem is that these high technology items, they are not labor intensive. They're capital intensive. They're getting more and more automated. So they don't offer the good jobs. And that's why the people who are displaced from intermediate and low technology production, like automobile and various other things, they had to work at lower wages in some cheap services. So the blue collar workers who were earlier producing these goods in, say, so-called Rust Belt, like Pittsburgh or like this place where they produce cars, Detroit. Okay, so they were very unhappy, and that's why when Trump promised them that I will bring the jobs back, they were happy and they voted for him. So blue collar workers were looking for better jobs. But the point is that given this technology division, that is not about to happen. Now, what does this do? This shifts the terms of trade between the advanced nations and the developing nations. So they supply goods at a high margin. We supply goods at a very low margin. So terms of trade shift against us. And therefore, the American citizens, the citizens of the advanced countries, getting all these day-to-day items at a low price, they could live beyond their means. The trade war that is taking place will aggravate this problem further for the US and for the world if other nations retaliate. So all nations may go protectionist for fear of dumping, because what's happening is with the US raising tariffs, everybody would be selling less in the US market, and therefore they'll have surpluses. And when they have surpluses, they'll try and sell it elsewhere at cheaper prices. So China will have surpluses, EU will have surpluses, India will have surpluses, and we'll try and sell it to each other. Now the danger is that if we start dumping on each other, then we will have to raise tariffs on everybody. And if that happens, if all countries begin to raise tariff on each other, then there'll be a global recession because everybody will face a higher tariff. They'll be able to sell less. They'll have surpluses in the economy. Their production will go down. So there'll be higher prices and there'll be a problem of surpluses. So if this tariff war aggravates because of what the US is doing, then there could be a recession that may come into the economy. So what are the consequences for the US economy? Whichever way we look at it, high tariffs on imports will lead to price rise in the USA. So even if they're able to produce more within the US economy, and that cannot be done quickly, that'll take time because they'll have to do the supply chains again. They'll have to get material and various other things, but that takes time. But internal production, because of the high wages, will not be cheap. And therefore, they'll have to have permanently high tariffs there, or they'll have to squeeze the workers' wages. In both cases, whether they have high tariffs permanently and therefore the prices are high in the US market, or they squeeze the wages, the living conditions of the workers will decline. And when that happens, then the demand within the economy would also decline. So even though because of this decline in demand, commodity prices may fall, but the chances of recession are there. And therefore, what will happen is that this problem will continue. So one way or the other, output will and demand in the US will decline. So in a sense, the prices will rise, the demand will decline, output may decline. So this is a stagflationary condition which will affect the US economy. Now, that is hard to deal with fiscal monetary policy, because if to boost demand, you lower interest rates, then the worry is that inflation would go further up. So in a sense, the stagflationary situation that may take hold in the US for some time may be a problem for the US economy. Now, we are already finding that the job creation in the US has declined in the last 4 months. Earlier they used to create a lot more jobs, but the data from the Labor Department is showing that now the job creation has declined. And that's why the President Trump was very unhappy, and he fired the head of the Labor Bureau, which gives out this data, because he says that you're not giving the correct data. But that's what is happening. Also, prices have not risen as much as they should have risen. And that is because all countries tried to export extra before the tariffs came in. So in the months of March, April, May, June, you found that a lot more exports were taking place. And as a result, there was stocking taking place, but that cannot last for very long. And therefore, prices will slowly rise. Already for day-to-day consumption items, the other day on CNN, they were showing a clip where everybody's complaining that for day-to-day items, prices have already been rising, and that is affecting the living standard of the workers in the USA. What is the position for India? India's weakness is in R&D, and therefore what happened is that WTO provided concessions for the underdeveloped countries. But what Trump is doing is he's removing these concessions on export from India. And he's asking India to come at par with the US. Now, given our technological weakness, that is not going to happen. We will remain for some time till our R&D is better, till our technology is better. We will be the underdog where we will have to worry about what the US is doing. So the impact will be that India's surplus in trade with US will decline. US was one of the few countries with which India had a surplus. With China, we have a huge deficit. With other countries like Japan and Southeast Asian countries, Australia, we have a deficit. So with our surpluses declining, our trade deficit will increase. So rupee will weaken. And what will happen is that that will bring in an inflationary pressure. Of course, that will help our exports to other countries. But as I said, on export, the market will be very flooded with a lot of extra surpluses from every country. So it will not be easy to increase India's export even at a lower price. Businesses which are going to be impacted, they'll either fire workers, or they'll squeeze the wages of workers, or they'll do both. So the workers will suffer. Agriculture cannot afford to open the market because our situation, as I mentioned earlier, is unequal situation. So agriculture, if our exports to the US of agriculture commodities and of fisheries and of milk, etc., they suffer. If we open the market and these things come in, then also the agriculture will suffer. So very likely with the squeeze on the wages, poverty will increase if we allow these kind of export from the US to take place, which is one of the conditions that is being asked for by President Trump. So India is being coerced to negotiate by Trump. Now, we were already giving concessions to the US. Like in the budget, we had lowered the customs duty on some of the items of relevance to the US. We were also already planning to buy more of defense items. In the month of April, our import of energy from the US went up by 270%. So we were trying to spend more in the US. to lower the deficit. Because even earlier, President Trump had complained about the trade deficit with India. So we were trying to negotiate that we will reduce it. So India is being coerced to give further concession. Now, if the global recession hits the world, then India will be hit very hard because unemployment will go up and the marginalized sections will be further affected. And our weakness in technology is such that wherever we have gone in for the free trade agreements, say like with Australia, with Southeast Asia, we have suffered. Our exports have not increased. Their exports to India have increased, so our deficit has gone up. We have had problems in negotiations. That's why with Britain, it took 3 years to negotiate because we had to concede certain things and get certain concessions from them. And because of the Brexit, Britain was very keen to have a free trade agreement, bilateral agreement with us. But by and large, our FTAs have not helped India, and the weakness is in technology. With EU, we've been negotiating for over 20 years. We have not yet finalized because of these difficulties. So coming to free trade agreements with other nations is a bit tricky for us because of our weakness in technology. So we get squeezed between China, Russia, and the US. Now we need defense equipment from the US. We need their market. So we have to agree. From Russia, we have had 30-40% of our equipment still from Russia. We need spare parts, so we get squeezed there. And with China, we have $100 billion trade deficit with them because we need everything from high technology to low technology. Many of our factories are run by the Chinese engineers. So we get squeezed from the Chinese also. We were trying to reduce our imports from China, but that's not happened. The trade deficit has increased from $85 billion to now $100 billion. So it's continuing to put a pressure on India. Now, what all this has meant is that there is a trend towards deglobalization and towards reconfiguring the international markets. So the trend for de-dollarization started with the Ukraine war. China has already been shifting its reserves away from the dollar. China has also been diversifying its trade. Now, after the Ukraine war, when the reserves of Russia were frozen and trade with Russia was becoming difficult, then there's been a move to use bilateral trade more away from the dollar. BRICS thought that they could do more of that, but President Trump did not like that because it knew that the special position of the US would be affected, and therefore he threatened extra duties on the BRICS countries if they thought of de-dollarization. But slowly there will be de-dollarization. It will take time. It will not happen immediately. And when that happens, the US and the advanced countries will find that they'll have difficulties because at the present they've been living beyond their means because they've been getting cheap goods from the developing world, which will become difficult for them if there is deglobalization and de-dollarization that is there. So globalization went against the marginalized, but deglobalization will actually further worsen the situation of the marginalized sections, and that impact our poverty, employment generation, and so on. So to conclude, for Trump, target is MAGA, Make America Great Again. But where does this again come? America was already, much better off than most other countries with $88,000 of per capita income. Germany has $55,000. Japan has $33,000. India is at $2,800 per capita income. So America was great, but he's trying to actually make it even more great by doing what he's doing. That is going to deepen the crisis of capitalism. And with AI advancing rapidly, the unemployment situation will get aggravated everywhere, even faster. So this crisis of capitalism is going to deepen. Now, the solution for more good jobs in America is not in having high tariffs. It is having better cooperation across nations so that we can manage our trade better. That's what WTO was doing. So he should have actually strengthened WTO rather than dismantling WTO. WTO is almost dismantled. So unless the trading partners with the US, unless they get together and they say, okay, we'll have WTO minus the US, until then, WTO will be dismantled. So what should India's approach be? Our approach should be that we should increase the internal problems. We should resolve our internal problems and strengthen our internal market. That means we need to strengthen agriculture, micro sector, employment generation, because this is a sector where 94% of the employment is. If these sectors get affected, then our demand problem will be there, our rate of growth will decline, and the problems will be there. And the problem is today, given that the opening up of the Indian economy has taken place after 1991, we cannot even go solo. So it's not Atmanirbharta that will come. It is having strong internal markets and strong R&D capabilities so that we can compete on equal terms. Today, we are competing on unequal terms because of lack of R&D. We have to bend to the other nations. So in brief, rather than mitigating the growing crisis of demand, Trump's protectionist move will only aggravate it. And therefore, the financial markets are somewhat reflecting it. The bond market in the US, the gold prices, the decline of the dollar, and India is caught in the midst of all that. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Professor. That was a very comprehensive, wonderful presentation.
Tariff is an extremely short-term, transactional strategy where he's squeezing and coercing countries to part with a lot of their wealth or investment into US. But the real problem of US, as you explained, minimum wages are much higher than anywhere else in the world. And the second part of this tariff strategy is that reshoring manufacturing back to the US. And that's not going to happen, particularly in the low manufacturing and intermediate manufacturing products. If that's not going to happen, then in the long run, the internal problems of the US is going to magnify. And people like John Mearsheimer are actually talking about the impending civil war that may likely break out. How much of all that is sort of a feasibility in your analysis?
So, as I said, if the US wants more production of these so-called intermediate goods, in the US, it'll have to maintain high tariffs and it'll have to cut wages. Both ways, the demand within the US economy would decline. And if the demand within the US economy declines, then it'll have a stagflationary situation. So in other words, he's not going to be able to succeed in bringing capital back to produce at prices which they were getting from China, India, Mexico, and so on. So the strategy will lead to stagflation because the demand will be less, production will be less, but the prices will be higher. So the stagflation situation will not help. That's why I said that this idea that you can use this to make America great again is not the right strategy. This will not make America great again. It'll create problems for the US, it'll create problems for the rest of the world. But you see, what has happened is that we must see that if this stagflation situation develops in the coming months, then the elections are coming in November 2026, and he may lose his majority in the Congress and the Senate. So the trifactor that he has at the moment, that means the presidency is there, the judiciary is with him, and also the Congress and the Senate are with him. That trifactor breaks. Now, already there are court cases that are there where he has been challenged that he does not have the authority to levy the tariffs. The authority to levy tariffs is only under emergency condition, but not under normal circumstances. It's that the tariff levy power is with the Congress. So if he loses and he has lost in the Court of Appeals, now he's going to appeal in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has to give his judgment. And suppose the Supreme Court also says, okay, he can use some powers, emergency powers, but not all. But there, you see, what he has done is he's cited India. In the appeal in the Supreme Court, he cited India, that India buying oil from Russia is helping Russia, which is a security concern. So therefore, from India, the tariffs will not be withdrawn. But it's possible that from other countries, these high tariffs may be reduced, okay, because the Congress may come into the picture. So it's a mixed bag at the moment. But I think by next year, middle, or maybe toward the end of next year, I think these tariffs will probably start coming down. Because I think the Congress will come into the picture and so on and so forth. But it's very uncertain. What will happen? There's a lot of uncertainty, and because of uncertainty, what happens is that people go into gold, and gold has been strengthening. Dollar was strengthening earlier, and dollar has declined because the credibility of the US economy has gone down. That's why dollar is going down. But according to the advisors of Trump, that is good because then US exports become cheaper in other countries. So they probably want the dollar to also decline somewhat as a result so that they can export more. But the point is that, other nations, if they agree to band together, then they can levy tariffs on the US, and then the US exports will not rise. So it's a very uncertain situation, and that's why investment overall in the world economy is suffering. Stock markets will suffer. At the moment, the American stock markets have risen because of the technology stocks. The 7 big technology companies, their stocks have risen, and that's why the stock market in the US is doing well. But otherwise, the stock market will also suffer because of the uncertainty, the lower investment, and people's uncertainty.
But then, like you said, he's been able to break, the countries separately and deal with each one, and literally coerce them to invest. He did that during his visit in the Middle East, into the Gulf countries. Then he's done it with UK. He's done it with Japan, South Korea. And but why are countries? I mean, when it's so obvious that they are being squeezed out, and these are one-sided, unequal, agreements. Why are countries falling into that trap?
So many of these countries like EU, Japan, South Korea, the West Asia, I don't call it Middle East, I call it West Asia.
True, that's right.
Because Middle East was for the British, for us it's West Asia.
Yeah.
They are dependent for security on the US. So they are not able to push so hard. But also the second thing is that everybody thought that I will get a better deal from US. So this beggar thy neighbor policy. Countries are falling into this trap because of this beggar thy neighbor policy, trying to extract better terms than other people have. Now, this I think will go slowly as countries realize that they're all suffering. And in this, China will have to take a lead because China has huge surpluses. Its trade with the US will go down at 30% duties. So it'll have a lot of surplus. China will have to assure everybody that we are not going to dump. China does that, then I think other nations can come to an agreement with each other, not to dump, but to have a balanced trade. And because what we were exporting to the US, that will not be there. And what we were importing from the US will also not be there. So each nation can export what they were exporting to the US to the other nation in a balanced way. So I think an agreement is possible that what we were importing from the US, we replace by importing from others, so that, we can increase our trade. It will not fall so much. But yes, there'll be an impact because the US is the largest economy. If everybody's trade with the US goes down, there will be an impact on everybody. There's no doubt. But it'll be much less than what it will be at the present.
But I think
also what will happen is that within 2 months, if we all agree to levy tariffs on the US, then within 2 months, I think US will have to back down.
Absolutely. Can the world get together?
Well, that's the big question. That's the big question. Whether, EU, India, Japan, South Korea, BRICS, whether we can all agree to it. Unfortunately, in the BRICS, India is not trusted very much because I think China knows that we were siding with the US board, etc. Russia has also not been trusting us very much because we moved away from buying equipment from them to the US. So I think the trust deficit in BRICS was there. Now, in SCO, we went and participated in the SCO. There's no doubt. We thought we'd get. But think about it. China and the Russians signed 22 agreements. But India and China did not sign one agreement. So I think India has to now assure other nations that its over-dependence on the US will not be there. So we need to have balance. And for that, we need R&D. Our R&D is so weak. We need for our defense equipment, we need from Russia, we need from America, we take from France. If we did not have so much dependence, and that's a strategic mistake we made over the last 50 years, that we have not developed enough R&D. We have decimated our education. Higher education is very poor. Without good higher education, how do you do good R&D? Now, America, in fact, is decimating its higher education by attacking the universities. Harvard, University of California, various other universities it is attacking. And therefore, a lot of the high research that was being done by these universities, that is going down. So America is also attacking R&D, which is a very foolish thing for it to do, because its lead was based on being the frontier of R&D. But on AI, it is moving very rapidly. Trump has announced a $500 billion program on AI. And I think the thinking is that these 7 technology companies, if they do well in AI, they do well, then they'll still be able to maintain their lead in technology. So I think that all eggs are now going into this AI basket, which is moving very rapidly. And the AI is the big threat because with AI, employment generation will be affected because we cannot retrain our workers very quickly to work with AI. And what is happening is that till now, technology used to displace, the physical labor. So like in farming, your use of hull bale was replaced by tractors, cutting crop was replaced by harvester combines, threshing was replaced by machines. But now mental labor, like call centers, BPOs, they are easy to replace, but even doctors' work, lawyers' work, chartered accountants' work, architects' work, a lot of it will be performed by AI. So that interns will not be required. The lower level and medium level people will not be required. So there'll be a lot of displacement. And where will that labor go? It is said that AI will generate jobs. True, it may generate jobs, but then it will not be able to generate, and especially in a country like India with a large amount of illiteracy and very poor education, there'll be a huge amount of displacement. Like to give an example, one of my relatives who's in software, he's devised an app. He takes a picture of your forehead and then it tells you what is your BP, what's your sugar and various parameters just by taking a picture. So, doctors' work is being replaced. Now, he told me that we are deliberately not making it very accurate. Otherwise, doctors will stop using it. He said we can make it very accurate, but at the moment, the strategy is not to make it so accurate. Similarly, another doctor friend of mine, you send him the picture of the skin. Suppose you have a boil and he puts it in the app and the app will tell you, that the app will tell you that, what is the boil, what is the medicine required for it, So in other words, you don't have to go to a skin specialist. So a lot of these things are happening, which will have a big effect. So on top of what Trump is doing, in the coming 2-3 years, all these things are also happening, which will actually muddy the water even further.
But China seems to have foreseen much of these developments for more than 5 to 6 years before Trump came in the second term.
Right.
So if you really see the data from China, they have diversified the
Correct.
trade across the world.
Yes.
They've reduced the exposure to the US
Correct.
down to 2.8% of their GDP.
Yes.
And their exports have actually increased in the last
Correct.
2 and
You're
they
right.
had a record trade surplus of 1.2 trillion
That's right.
last year. So China seems to have got their strategy reasonably right.
Correct.
Absolutely. But like
and also they've reduced their foreign exchange reserves. America, they've diversified to other currencies. So you're absolutely right. They've foreseen this because the pressure on China was being built even during the Trump presidency.
That's right.
And then Biden had withdrawn the software personnel and put a ban on providing them with high technology chips. The NVIDIA M100 and M200 chips. And now they're giving them the modified chips. And China said, we don't want these modified chips from NVIDIA. So China's had a strategy. So in global situation, any nation which wants to go ahead has to have a strategy. Unfortunately, India has not had that kind of a strategy, whether in R&D, whether in terms of trade, whether in terms of other things. So we need to build a strategy of how we will go about it. So we need short term, medium term, and long term. In the short term, we have to go with the internal market. But in the long run, we have to go for excellent education to all children and very high capability in R&D. That's China has gone ahead because even as you know, in AI, they came with DeepSeek within a few months after the ChatGPT 4 came. And the DeepSeek is using a different algorithm. So it's able to actually outcompete ChatGPT in terms of the use of the computers. China is looking at all this, in a very strategic manner.
Absolutely. So I think, from what you've explained, we are fairly vulnerable to the coercive strategy of Trump's administration, particularly in the areas, we are heavily dependent for our service exports in the IT sector. And if we open up our agriculture, I believe we'll be doomed, actually. Yes. And then the products that we export are largely in machinery, in textiles, and pharma. And all of these are, very easily, can be made targeted and made vulnerable to us as well. And therefore, our biggest vulnerabilities are R&D and lack of mastery in certain areas of technology. So we need to probably go on a very long-term strategy with very clear, a process of, I would say, decoupling from the American dependency. And I certainly feel we should not go ahead on the defense at all, but this is a time we need to actually look at other alternatives which will not make us so vulnerable in terms of coercive approach to, being vulnerable to American coercive approach that impacts on our strategic autonomy as well. So how do you feel? Because defense is what is looking at. They want to de-link us from the Russians and take over our defense market and the agriculture market as well.
Strategic requires us to move rapidly on the R&D front, because only when we are capable of generating large amount of technology in various critical areas, like for instance, the light combat aircraft, as you know very well, we could not produce even one because the G404 engine didn't come. It's come out in the last 2-3 months. And therefore, the order of 87 and now the order of 90 cannot be fulfilled unless they supply us enough G404. And then talking about G404, as you know, is the 1980s technology. G414, which we are trying to get from them, is the 1990s technology. That's still not the 2000s technology. And even on G414, they have not signed an agreement. I think there are difficulties about technology transfer and so on. So we are not able to do that. We were not able to reverse engineer the Sukhoi aircraft engine or the MiG aircraft engine also. The Chinese successfully reverse engineered and they moved ahead. They've got a 5th generation aircraft and they also unveiled a 6th generation aircraft, according to reports. Now, whether they are correct or not, but 5th generation aircraft apparently they have got, but 6th generation aircraft also they're claiming. So in other words, China, because of its long-term planning, is able to do all this. We are not able to do it. We are destroying our higher education. When we destroy higher education, how will you do R&D? How will you have enough trained people? And because we are not doing good research, anybody who's good in research goes to the Americans or to the Australians or to the British or to the Europeans. So we are not able to retain talent. Now it's said like that H-1B visa, now people return, we'll be able to use. But unless we open good labs and give them autonomy to work in the labs and so on, it won't happen. Another thing is R&D requires us to also accept failure. But in India, we think that, if research is not giving you a result, then it's a failure. Why waste money on it? But for every successful experiment, there are 100 unsuccessful experiments, because that's how you learn. That how to produce, So like for the one Michelson-Morley experiment to prove that there's no ether, hundreds of failed experiments were there. Then only you came to Michelson-Morley experiment, and that changed the face of world, because then you went to relativistic mechanics and quantum mechanics after that. Otherwise, we are stuck in the Newtonian mechanics world. So in other words, we have to accept that, there will be failures. That's part of learning. And that's part of doing research. It cannot be that everything would succeed. So we have to trust our scientists. We have to trust our educationists that if they are given support, but unfortunately in the universities, the support is not given to individual researchers. There is a bureaucracy. Many teachers are very bureaucratic, the senior people. So they don't give the autonomy to the junior people. Then the Ministry of Human Resource does not give autonomy to the universities. The UGC does not give autonomy to the universities. It keeps cutting funds. So we should be spending a lot more on our educations, whether at primary level, secondary level, higher education, and on R&D. But we have never exceeded 4% of GDP on public education. So we need to A, give autonomy, and B, give resources. Because these are expensive things. When you do high research, it is an expensive thing. It's not going to come cheap. In the US, etc., they spend hundreds of billions of dollars, and we are not spending even a fraction of that. So we cannot spend that kind of money. But if we give autonomy and we open these labs where people who may return from the US and the advanced countries and give them autonomy to function, then maybe we can also do much more research. But our research is stultified by this high bureaucracy that is there in the universities. They didn't want good education for children of poor. When I switched from physics PhD at Princeton to doing a PhD at JNU in economics, I went and did rural development for 1 year. And there the landlord used to tell us, why are you teaching these children of the poor people? If you teach them, who will give me free labor? So don't teach these children. So in our country, the attitude is not to give a good education to all children. So you know that Allahabad High Court had a judgment 7 years back where it said that the children of the bureaucrats and of the politicians should go to government schools, then only government schools will improve. So what has happened is that there are some schools, some colleges, some universities which are privately run where the funds are flowing, but in public education, funds are being curtailed. So whether it be JNU or Delhi University, the two best universities you had, there's deep fund cutting. And therefore, what has happened is that the research of the high order that should be done is not being done in good, and good universities are being decimated. So you have to appoint competent people. You can't appoint people because they belong to a certain ideology. You have to find people who are good at research, who are good at teaching, who do justice to the students rather than belong to certain ideology. So this is decimating our universities, it's decimating our research. So we have to be very conscious of a larger change in society. This feudal attitude, that has to be taken care of. Where we go towards a more open society, towards the more, openness in our thinking and so on. If we are restricting our thinking, then that will not be good for research and development. So the research development environment has to be built in India. That is not
absolutely what you said is bang on. We have a problem of zero error syndrome, in our research. That's one. And second is in terms of gross expenditure on R&D, we spend a very puny 0.69% of our GDP of 2.8 trillion or 3 trillion, 3.5 trillion today. China spends about 2.4 to 3%, almost 20 trillion, right?
Yeah.
So I think that shows up, but the zero error syndrome is another major contributory factor to this entire process as well. You're right. We have to get rid of the feudal mindset, and we'll have to, get out of commercializing education and bring it into a very high level of expertise and excellence. That is what should be the focus.
And commitment should be there.
Commitment, absolutely.
Good research and good teaching comes out of commitment. We should not break the back of our teachers and our researchers because then their commitment will go. So autonomy of academics is very crucial. If you don't give autonomy, then their heart will not be in the research or teaching, and then our teaching and research will suffer. So that's very necessary. So even though we have a new education policy 2020, and it talks about autonomy, but that's only formal. In practice, that is not there. And everything that is being done is actually to kill the autonomy of the universities and so on. There's a lot of contradiction in this new education policy also. We have to see that. For instance, we are saying that we have to decolonize the Indian mind, but then we are inviting foreign universities. When you invite foreign universities to come in, they're not going to decolonize, they're going to bring their own framework and they'll colonize you further. So if you want to decolonize, we have to really talk about how to absorb the current knowledge and then go forward. Macaulay's policy was to split education from research, and therefore people started mugging up. So most of our teaching is actually mugging up. So we mug up and then we forget. So, from 1984, when I started teaching in JNU, I've been giving open book exams. And children say, sir, please don't give open book exam because we cannot think in an exam. I have complete sympathy because for 15 years, they've been mugging up and appearing in exam. But I said, you should know there's one exam where you don't have to mug up. You have all your notes with you. You have all the formulae. You only have to apply. So how to apply knowledge, that is the critical thing. It's not simply that I mug up the knowledge and regurgitate it. Application is very poor in India. So we have high education, but application is not there.
Absolutely. Professor, we have quite a few questions on the chat box. Let me start off with the first one, Furpa Wangdi. His question is, why is the US targeting India with 50% tariff and hike in H-1B visa fee? What's New Delhi's stand? I think you more or less explained that, but
that's right.
Answer that.
Yeah.
And the second question is from Tejaswini. Sir, given that the US tariff strategy under Trump seems less about reciprocity and more about coercion, do you think India should continue negotiating within this asymmetric framework? Or is it time for India to proactively build an alternative coalition, say BRICS, SCO, or Global South partners to reshape a multipolar trade order outside the US dominance?
I think we have to do both. We cannot ignore the US market to begin with, because that's our biggest market. China is overtaken because of the problems that Trump has created. But simultaneously, we must try and build more equitable and better relationship with others. Unfortunately, in BRICS, we have not been playing that good role. So I think there's suspicion in the BRICS and also in the SCO. We need to assuage these suspicions that are there in SCO and BRICS. We also need to deal in more equitable terms with the other South Asian countries. But because we are weak in technology, we are not going to be able to play the big role that China can play, which EU can play, which Japan can play. So I think what we need to do is we need to try and get together with Japan, China, EU, and so on, and then together try and build a WTO minus the US. I think it's not beyond our capability because we are quite weak in terms of technology and in terms of trade. So I don't think other nations will listen to us. But if we have a bloc, and we have to try and convince this bloc that the problem is coming from US tariffs, so we need to get together to actually do this. And we have to show to the other countries that if we don't do it, then the global situation may turn into a recession, which will impact everybody. So to ward that off, we have to try and get Trump off this high horse.
There's another question from Konda Ramamurthy who says, what is the problem in diversifying to new export markets instead of the US? I think
I think we will try that. There's no doubt, but it takes time to build those chains. You have to establish dealerships and so on. And already what's happening is that I was on a panel discussion where the head of the MSME in Ludhiana was there, and he was saying it's not so easy to establish new markets because you don't have your people there, you don't have your supply chains over there. But we will try, he said. And also he said that the EU is already coercing us because they know that we have surpluses which we are not able to sell in the US. They are asking for greater discounts. And we are not able to afford to give them that discount because our margins are very low. So in other words, we will try, there's no doubt. But I think what will happen is that businesses will squeeze the wages because they'll be squeezed by the other markets like EU is trying to ask for discount. So for our traders to supply, they'll have to squeeze the wages to lower the cost. So the burden will fall on the workers.
Bhavana has she's array with us. She has a question. She says, thank you for such an insightful discussion, sir. You mentioned that soft capitalism has shifted to much harder form of capitalism through Trump's moves, and therefore there is a rise in right-wing politics across the world. Can you elaborate on that point a little more?
Yeah. So, I see this a hard face of capitalism emerging from the mid-1970s. It's not just with Trump. Trump is at the culmination of a 40-year program of this rise of the hard face of capitalism. That's why I mentioned that in WTO, in GATT, the American negotiator said to our negotiator that we will now get your agriculture market opened up. And also what used to be called trade till 1990 has become capital movements. And capital movements require us to give concessions to the multinationals for bringing in their capital. So in other words, these kind of changes have been taking place from GATT to WTO. WTO also, we were coerced. Like I went to Seattle round of negotiations in 1999. And there the developing world negotiators are running around trying to figure out where the negotiations are taking place. And what the advanced countries did was, like, for instance, in agriculture, they made, I think, Sierra Leone or, maybe Singapore as the head. Now, they have hardly any agriculture. So that the advanced nations could get their thing in agriculture. Similarly, on labor, they had some very small country as the head of the negotiations. And our negotiators did not know where the negotiations were taking place. So therefore, all these negotiations at Seattle were taking place purely under the big nation, richer nations, and they were extracting concessions. So in the 1999, the WTO head was booed in the closing ceremony because the developing world negotiators did not know where the negotiations took place. So they were booing the head of the WTO at that point of time. And then, after China joined, Then, from Doha round, etc., the developing world started also raising its voice, etc. So China joining strengthened the hands, but India was not a leader in the WTO because in 1987, the developing world had made Brazil and India the representative for negotiating with the advanced countries. And we backstabbed them. Rajiv Gandhi came in trouble, and the Brazilian president came under trouble. So therefore, we actually did not represent the interest. So I noticed in the Seattle round, the developing world said we don't trust India and Brazil. But when China joined, that happened. Huh? But the point is that we see the World Bank saying in the mid 80s that we know that poverty will increase with our policy, so we need to have safety net. But that safety net is not really a panacea. It doesn't generate jobs. Okay, it only prevents people from falling below poverty further. So we also from 2005 implemented the safety net in the country with right to food, right to education, right to work, etc., etc. Now that was not a solution. Jobs are still a problem. So from 2015, World Bank started saying we have to give universal basic income. That means we have to give income in the hand of everybody because a lot of people will not have work. Now, this goes against the capitalist principle because capitalist principle, as Kaletsky points out, is that you pay for work done. You don't pay for work not done. And that's why subsidy is frowned at. Okay. But the situation is deteriorating all the time. Employment generation is a problem. Demand is a problem. And therefore, what was happening was that capitalism was slowly taking a rightward shift. Then as soon as the Russian Soviet bloc collapsed, East Europe did not have capital. And because of that, they started cutting taxes. And when they started cutting taxes, there was what is called the race to the bottom. That means everybody had to cut taxes. Germany cut taxes, Britain cut taxes, France cut taxes. So their public sector programs suffered. So therefore, the public sector declined, So that again, the welfareism was declining as a result. And then along with that came BEPS, base erosion profit shifting. Large corporations were setting up their corporation headquarters in countries with low taxes. So like Ireland has done very well. A lot of Google and others are headquartered there because the tax rates are very low. So this base erosion profit shifting and this race to the bottom meant that public sector resources were declining. So welfareism was declining, which is again a swing to the right. This has been accelerated by Trump. So this move from the mid-70s that has been going on in the mid-90s, and then, with WTO coming and the World Bank changing its line to universal basic income to what Mr. Trump is doing now. So Mr. Trump has exposed the hard face, which has been developing since the mid-70s.
Okay. Oh, that's wonderful. There's a question from Priyanka. In terms of supply chain diversification, where global companies were looking to set up in India amongst few other countries, how much can this tariff war affect this trend?
Well, this tariff war is creating huge uncertainty because we don't know that, if they set up here in India, then whether they'll be able to export to the US market. So that will be a problem that will be there. So, already, as you know, the net FDI into India has become very small now because there's a lot of outgo of capital from India. So there's FDI coming in, but there's a lot of capital going out also. So the net inflow of foreign direct investment has fallen by something like 90% in the last few years. So the chances that, under the present situation, FDI will increase, the net FDI will increase into India are very small. So companies will wait for this situation to stabilize. They'll wait to see what the US does, whether it continues with these penal tariffs or not, before they actually make a decision to invest in India.
Gladwin has a question. We often hear that trade and defense ties go hand in hand. With the US tariff strategies in play, do you think stronger India-US defense cooperation could actually help ease some of the trade challenges between these two countries?
Well, we have offered to the US to buy more equipment from them. There's no doubt. F-35 was being talked about. F-35 is there all over Europe also. So these kind of things can happen. But I think more importantly, this idea that we will have to strategic partner, we have to behave and give concessions to the US. And Trump being very transactional, and he's extracting concessions from everybody. But the two concessions that he wants us to give to him, that I think we'll not be able to comply with. So given that, those problems will continue, I think at this point, it is very difficult for us to trust the Americans because you don't know how the situation will develop. He has another 3.5 years to continue. So I don't think if there's lack of trust between nations, then the developing closer ties becomes that much more difficult because you can be jacked. Already you can see that US has been drifting towards Pakistan. The way the Pakistani general was having lunch with Trump, which is never done. Already crypto investment by Pakistan are being lauded by him. Various things are happening which do not give a very positive spin to developing closer ties with the US. So even though we would like to have closer ties with the US because that's a big market, a lot of Indians are working there, a lot of remittances come from there. So we are heavily dependent, but to trust them with everything is going to be difficult. So I think we have to become strategically more autonomous, and we have to expand our trade with others. We have to expand technology cooperation with others also.
Absolutely. I think the trust factor has been broken significantly with Trump's action and this tariff issues. But on the issue of defense, we've actually given a significant business over the last 15, 17 years. I think we've bought equipment to the tune of $24 to $28 billion.
Right.
And not much is beneficial in terms of industry and in terms of technology access. They're all off the shelf by and large. And the US State Department laws with respect to technology is extremely stringent. The companies don't have any freedom. State Department controls it. And there is no way the US will part with any access to give us access to technology. And that's going to be a serious problem. The trust now, as you mentioned, as the trust is broken, I would say we need to rethink on our defense strategy completely in terms of going further with the US unless the US comes to meet halfway towards meeting our interests as well. We'll have to play our strategy extremely well, in my opinion. Himanshi has the question. So you talked about the trust deficit with China, which can be the most important and immediate steps which India should push forward towards coming to table and materializing agreements with China. Your views?
With China, we have a tricky situation because of the border. It's not going to be easy to solve that problem unless China also sees it in its major interest. But I think China realizes that we have gone to SCO without solving the border problem. We are trying to negotiate. So I think it already realizes that India is facing problem with the US and therefore coming to SCO and negotiating. So China is not going to concede. I think the problem that we will have is with China that we will have to concede, So it will be somewhat one-sided, unfortunately, because at this point, militarily, financially, technologically, it is much ahead of us. And I think now China also sees that India is really not that big a competitor for it. It wants to establish itself with One Belt, One Road initiative all over Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America. And you see, the US has been seeing China as a threat. And US has been using India to sort of balance China because we have populations very similar to each other. But China doesn't see it that way. In Asia, it thinks it's the premier power. And therefore, it's not going to be easy for us to do that. But nonetheless, we'll have to try given our situation. So we have to act externally vis-a-vis our neighbors, but internal strength is the key. Unless we develop the internal strength to be able to face off, we will not be able to negotiate on equal terms with other big powers.
Absolutely. And that's what Jeffrey Sachs also points out. The US is using India as a pawn while having gone a little soft on China in recent times in the tariff issue as well. Marshall has a question. How can the United States and India resolve their tariff disagreements and develop a more cooperative and long-standing trading relationship?
Yeah.
I think you've spoken quite a lot of that. Absolutely. And Hannah has another question. Thank you, sir, for insightful session on US tariffs. I'd like to know more about to what extent can India counterbalance the negative effects of US tariffs by diversifying its trade partnership with EU, BRICS, and the intra-Asian frameworks?
So certainly, I mean, as I said, we cannot ignore the US. We can do what we must, but we now realize that we cannot depend on the US market so much. And therefore, we have to try that. But it'll take a lot of effort from the government, from our businessmen to actually do that. And I think already the Indian government is realizing that we have to try and make the effort. So they are speeding up negotiations with EU also. We have been negotiating for more than 2 decades with the EU for a free trade agreement. It has not happened. But as I said, free trade agreements with Australia, with Southeast Asia, etc., were not favorable to us because of our technological weakness. They extract concessions from us. They're able to export more to us than we are able to increase our export. So I think given our situation, we have to act, as I said, internally, and we have to act externally both. But if we are able to develop our market, the internal market, we are able to generate demand from the unorganized sector, which is 94% of the workers. Today, that sector is suffering. And therefore, demand here is weak, and therefore growth here is weak. If our growth, even though the government keeps saying our growth is 6.5 to 7%, but that does not take into account the unorganized sector data. If the unorganized sector, which is declining since demonetization, is taken into account, then we are growing only at 1.5, 2 or 2.5%. So that's why I keep saying we are not yet the 4th largest economy. We are not at $3.8 trillion. We are still $2.5 trillion because the unorganized sector is declining, and there's enough evidence for that. You can see that from leather goods sector, from luggage industry. You can see that in the trade sector, where the neighborhood stores are declining, whereas e-commerce is growing at 25-30%. The malls are growing. So all that organized sector trade is increasing. Unorganized sector trade is decreasing. Similarly, you see that in other sectors also. And employment generation has been very poor because the unorganized sector employs 94%. And if that is declining, then employment generation will not be good. Even if you have 6.5% growth of the organized sector, that's highly mechanized and automated. So you can take, for instance, the banking sector as an example. In 1990, for everything, we had to go inside the bank branch for withdrawing cash, for passbook, checkbook, etc. Now we can do most of that on our mobile phone. We don't go to the bank branch. So even though the work of banks has increased 1,000-fold, the workforce has become half. So organized sector is not going to generate jobs. It's the unorganized sector, but the unorganized sector is declining. And therefore, this 94% employment, that is declining. And that's why we have a huge unemployment problem, especially amongst women and amongst youth. So if we generate more demand in the unorganized sector, our market will expand, our organized sector will expand, our growth rate will go up, and then foreign capital will also want to come in and participate in it. At the moment, our private sector is not investing enough. The Ministry of Finance keeps saying, you are not investing enough. We are doing more public investment, but you're not doing enough. And that is because they say we don't have enough demand. So if capacity utilization data, which comes from RBI, shows capacity utilization is between 70-75%, then why would they invest to increase the investment further? Because then demand being the same, they'll not have more this thing, and therefore unutilized capacity will rise. So in other words, internal market is crucial. We have to change our strategy from only helping the organized sector and decimating the unorganized sector to helping the unorganized sector. If the unorganized sector does well, the organized sector will also do well. More foreign capital will also come in, and more development will take place. So our strategy has to completely change. You look at the budget. In the budget, we are allocating out of capital items more funds to highways and railways and to IT and power sector. But these are all capital intensive. Earlier in a road project, you'd see hundreds of people working. Now in a road project, you see 10 people working because what happens is that now you use more bulldozers, more big cranes, etc., etc. So only 10 people are working at a site, whereas earlier hundreds of people. And what will happen is big highways and big railways, they will enable the organized sector to penetrate into rural markets, and the unorganized sector will further decline. So in other words, we have to build bottom up from the unorganized sector up. And if the unorganized sector does well, the organized sector will also do well. So it won't be a zero-sum game, it will be a positive-sum game. So we have to completely change our strategy. We are using demonetization, GST, then digitization, etc., to help the organized sector, but that's killing the unorganized sector. So it's the wrong strategy. Even GST has actually have a negative effect on our unorganized sector, because they don't get input credit. So their prices doesn't fall, the price of the organized sector falls. So demand shifts from the unorganized to the organized sector. So all these steps have actually been killing the unorganized sector, whereas we need to boost it.
Absolutely. I think it needs a bottoms-up approach, and an indication of that was given by one of the 5-year plan experts in China. It just come out a few days back in the South China Morning Post, and an excellent analysis. Syed has a question here. He's saying there's another angle. US has 35 trillion. It is 37 trillion. Global, no, it's not global debt. It's domestic debt. And Trump's recent actions to bring more dollar through tariffs, steps to increase production and export, and high tax are only balancing the debt and prevent from crisis. Is this argument right? Kindly shed light on this. Yeah.
So, as I said, in my presentation, what these tariffs do is to put a tax on purchases in the US. When you send a good worth 100 rupees, then it becomes 150 rupees in the US. So our exporters can cut their margin a little bit, but they cannot cut by 50%. So in the US market, the price goes up, right? And when the price goes up in the US market, it means the demand there will fall. And when the demand there falls, then it'll tend to be stagflationary in the US market. So that's why I'm arguing that what these tariffs will do is not create a better market in the US. It'll actually decrease the market in the US. What they are saying is that we will be able to produce more within the US economy. Now, intermediate good and low technology things, you'll not be able to produce because your wages are very high. With the same technology applicable everywhere, you'll not be able to produce more in the US market unless you're willing to take high prices. The moment you take high prices, the workers' wages will, in real terms, fall, and therefore demand will fall. So whether you produce within or you get stuff with high tariff, either way the price in the US market will rise. So that's a simple analysis. What happens is people get confused by bringing in all kinds of other extraneous items into the analysis.
Professor, we are coming towards the end of this thing. There's one last question from Gladwin, where he says, with the US showing unpredictability in trade and defense policy, and Russia struggling with delays in mass production of the fifth-generation fighter jets like Su-57, India faces tough choices. In such a scenario, what's the smarter path? What would be the best option for India to invest more in building a truly self-reliant defense industry?
Well, that takes time.
Yes.
So what you have to do is you have to have a short-term strategy and a long-term strategy. As I said, the short-term strategy has to be that you have to build your market, so that your industry, which will face problem or demand, because exports will be more difficult. Given the dumping, given the problems of tariffs, etc., possibility of a trade war, you can't depend on the export market like you've been depending till now. You have to build your internal strength. So that be a short-term strategy. In the long run, as I said, there's no escaping R&D. There's no escaping improvement in education. School up. At every level, you have to build your this thing. So as I've been arguing for the last 30 years, we don't know how to create an Einstein. It happens, The more people that there are in your education system, it's like a shotgun approach. Somebody will do very well, So therefore, you don't know how to produce good scientists and technologists, They happen because your education system encourages questioning. At the moment, we are a very feudal society. We don't encourage questioning. In the classroom, in large number of schools, there's no questioning. If you question, then you're called a troublemaker, and then you're thrown out of the class, Whereas actually, we must encourage questioning by our students, So in other words, this feudal attitude has to be tackled. That'll take time. It doesn't happen automatically. It doesn't happen in the short run. But when there's a crisis like this, if the leadership is correct, if the leadership has a vision, then it can tackle this feudal element also. So I think this feudal element, this increase in R&D, this increase in education, they have to go hand in hand in a medium-term and long-term strategy. Short term, there's no other option but to boost the unorganized sector, boost the internal market, create demand, make your organized sector grow, and make the organized sector R&D compliant, because they're not doing any R&D. Our private organized sector does no R&D. We have to try and force them to do R&D so that they absorb technology and develop. Otherwise, what happens is we do repeated import of technology. Like in the automobile sector, we have technology from Hyundai, from Toyota, from VW, and so on and so forth, but very little internal development of technology. So in various fields, you have to develop indigenous capabilities. And we are a big nation of 145 crores. We can do that. Our engineering training has to be better. Large number of our engineers are not trained properly. We have fake degrees, this Vyapam thing where they have fake degrees of engineers, doctors. We have coaching. We don't teach well in the school, and then all our public exams require mugging up. So we have coaching. We have tuitions. So we are spending on education, but not doing the right thing. This coaching is only preparing you for an exam. It's not helping you absorb knowledge to actually develop further knowledge. Whereas R&D requires you to absorb knowledge and then develop further knowledge. So coaching, etc., doesn't help. Your exams should not be simply a way of giving a passport to a degree, passport to a job. It should be for understanding how much have you absorbed the knowledge and how much can you apply. Our exams are only measuring our capacity to mug up and reproduce in the exam and then forget it. So we need to change our attitude in a big way as far as our knowledge generation is concerned.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, so here's the final, your comments required. How much of Trump's actions and his tariff strategy is driven by Stephen Meron?
That I don't know. People say that there are various people who are advising him, but they, according to the liberal side, they are all ignorant. They don't understand. This fellow, Jeffrey Sachs has said that Trump is an ignorant person. He doesn't understand economics. He's also smart. There's no doubt he's got the whole world, under his thumb. And, that's not easy to do if you are not smart. So, but his smartness is of the wrong kind. Smartness is not long-term. It's a very short-term smartness. So he can maybe help the American economy in the short run, but in the long run, the lead of America will go. China is going to lead the way because China is moving in very rapidly in Latin America, in Africa. And if this continues and the other nations suffer, they may look toward China, for greater support. So, the US has to act more smart. And I think, after the next election in November 2026, maybe the situation begins to change as pressures build up on him, as courts put pressure on him. Because in America, one thing is there that the autonomy of some institutions is still there. Universities are resisting, courts are resisting, the liberal press was resisting. He's decimating the liberal press one by one, but still there's resistance, So maybe if democracy survives, maybe there'll be a reversal of things over the coming 2-3 years. That's our only hope.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much, Professor Rosen. It's been a wonderful session of, your views. Hearing you was a great pleasure. And it was always a great pleasure for the Peninsula Foundation to host you. And your knowledge and your ideas are extremely useful and pleasurable to hear as well. Thank you so much for being with us today. And let me hand over to Hannah for the word of thanks. Yeah, Hannah.
Thanks for organizing it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. First, thank you for giving us the insightful session on US tariffs. And thank you, sir. And thank you all of you all to attend this webinar.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay,
Thank
bye.
you.